Okay, this is going to be the video for week 2, our coverage of a little bit of East Africa and West Africa. The volume on this might be a little iffy. I can't really figure out what's going on right now. I think it's the mic that I'm using is kind of weak. So you might want to turn the volume up on this video. Be careful if you turn the volume up on your computer as a whole, because if you're listening to this and then you switch over to one of the supplemental videos on YouTube, the volume might be very loud and it might rattle you, particularly if you're using headphones. So watch out for that. Make sure that in the YouTube browser or whatever you're listening to this in, make sure that you have the volume up. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Maasai, pastoralists in Eastern Africa. So what I'd like for you to do is to just pause this and watch the first video, men taking meat from lions. It's of some Maasai men contending with lions for some wildebeest meat. And watch this video and then come back to the next slide. Okay, so who were these men who did this kind of daring feat, who took this meat from these hungry lions and demonstrated such courage, such boldness, such confidence? They come from a culture, a tribe called the Maasai. The Maasai is kind of this overarching culture with a number of different subgroups, and they inhabit the border regions of Kenya and Tanzania. You can see here. And, you know, they're not the majority in either of these countries. They're a minority, and they don't really, the border doesn't mean very much to them traditionally, due to the fact that they wander both sides of it. You can see here that in this image of Maasai man, he has his mother, his elderly mother, his 2 wives, and what looks like 7 children there. And the Maasai are polygynous, meaning that one man will have multiple wives. Just keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so the Maasai are pastoralists. In this regard, they're similar to the steppe nomads from Central Asia that we looked at with the video on the Silk Road. And like with the nomads of Central Asia, or even in the pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas, the Apache who roamed what's now the southwestern United States, people are living in desert regions. It's very, very tough to survive. So the culture adapts. The culture becomes tougher to meet these changing circumstances, these difficult circumstances rather. And you know, the Maasai follow around primarily herds of cattle. Thus we say that they're pastoralists. They follow their herds of cattle from watering hole, lead their herds of cattle rather from watering hole to watering hole. So they're nomadic or semi-nomadic traditionally. And much of what we're going to talk about is the traditional Maasai way of life, because we're going all the way back to 1500, before the 1960s, when the independent governments of Kenya and Tanzania tried to alter this traditional way of life. And like the steppe nomads of Asia, these are militaristic people in the sense that there's a strong warrior tradition defending these herds from rustlers, taking other cattle from enemy groups. And in this regard, this is similar to kind of the borderlands between England and Scotland, or medieval Ireland, in that you have these groups of herders and shepherds kind of waging intermittent wars between one another. And it's similar with the Maasai. Also, just to throw in there, for anyone who is big on the Atkins diet, this is a diet, the Maasai derive almost all of their calories traditionally, if they're eating a traditional diet, from cow-related products. Right? So they're eating the beef, they're drinking milk, they're eating cheese made from milk, and they're drinking the blood of cows mixed with a few herbs gathered from the surrounding environment. So, this is, and keep that in mind as we talk about, the fact that this traditional diet for the Maasai is very healthy. Heart disease is a problem for the Maasai now, but they're actually, this is due to the fact that they're eating government-supplied foods that's not part of their, that aren't part of their traditional fare. So I just want to keep that in mind, in that we have all kinds of diverse diets all over the world, and in the traditional sense, usually people are nourished by these diets, even though they can be very different. Okay, so you see this braided hair here on these men. They're called Morans. They are warriors. This means that they're warriors, that they're capable of defending their community. The Maasai organize the male population into what is known as age sets, or age grades. The age set is a group of men or boys living in the same phase of life, living separately from one another. This is very common in different parts of Africa. The reason for this is that it reduces population density, which we'll talk about in a moment, why that's something very beneficial in this kind of environment. But also, it allows the young men to be in close contact with mentors who can hone these young men into better warriors to defend the community. This is a very rough environment. Keep that in mind. These men have to be very bold, very courageous, like you saw in the video, to protect and provide for their families and community. Women will enter their husband's age set upon marriage. Okay, so when a woman is married, usually that's the senior warrior age set when a man will marry around in his late 30s. There are ceremonies of transition in between these age sets. Between the ages of 12 and 20, Maasai boys undergo circumcision, and then they become warriors, or Morans, as it's called in Maasai. And the women undergo circumcision also. This is at a much earlier age. You can see here these boys are in the black cloaks that signify that they're in a period of healing after circumcision. So once the circumcision is complete, the Maasai man becomes a warrior, and he goes and joins the junior warrior age set out in the bush. And if he survives that phase, he's then a senior warrior. And then if he survives that phase, a junior elder, then a senior elder, etc. Lions hold a very special place within Maasai society. For example, the god Ingai had created lions as kind of a model for human behavior. Right? The male lion is a symbol of power, of strength, of protection for women and children. So the lion is very significant, and the lion is also an enemy in that the lion attempts to steal calves or even attack people. So contending with lions is a big part of the manhood of these warriors. And you can imagine this traditionally. First, if you would pause this video and watch the video of the lion attack, if you want to. I'm warning you that the video is a little bit graphic. So if you don't mind, if you want to watch it, go ahead and pause this and watch that video and come back. Alright, so if you watched the video, you saw how the lioness, cornered lioness, attacked one of the Morans, one of the warriors, and how, even though he was seriously wounded, he had to chase the lioness down and kill her because of his honor, because of his pride. And of course, he died to preserve that pride. He ended up dying from his injuries while chasing this lioness. And you can imagine the ferocity of, and this is a lioness, which is smaller than the male lion. Male lions are generally much bigger, especially as they're in the prime of their lives. But in Maasai tradition, boys prior to circumcision, or immediately after circumcision, would go out and hunt their first lion. So imagine a boy, 12, 13 years old, with a spear and a shield, attacking and contending with a grown male lion. And this, this is something that is really astounding. They don't have high-powered rifles, no 30-06, no 357 pistol as a backup. All right, they have a spear, a knife, and a shield, and of course, you have to be extremely brave to do this. And traditionally, many young boys died attempting to do this. But it's seen as a necessity due to the fact that these young men have to become brave warriors. And you can see this Moran here wearing this headdress. This headdress most likely made by his mother or one of his wives or a sister or girlfriend as a sign of his virility for killing this lion. And this is another example of how modern governments clash with indigenous populations, with traditional populations rather. The governments of Tanzania and Kenya both banned these hunts. And this is due to a desire, I think, to preserve these animals for tourists who want to go on safari. And what's kind of astounding to me is that if you pay a certain fee, you can actually go and hunt these creatures on a limited basis, which is, a lot of people see that as kind of an injustice, in that if you heard recently about the young woman from Texas, young undergraduate student who went to, I can't remember, was it Kenya or Tanzania, or was it a different country? I can't remember the specifics, but she hunted an elephant, a lion, I believe it was a rhinoceros, some other creatures, and took all these photos, put them up on Twitter, and I think her name was it Kendall Jones? I don't know why that name's popped up in my head. But anyway, it stirred a debate about whether or not that was appropriate. Her father was able to pay the fee so that she could go and hunt these creatures. And of course, the Maasai, who are not responsible for the deforestation, habitat destruction that's harming different forms of wildlife, they are actually barred from participating in their traditional culture. So, it's an aspect of tourism to think about, whether or not tourism helps or hurts different populations throughout the world. You can see these Morans here, these warriors, have their traditional spears with the leather shields, and when they do battle, they'll do battle in a manner similar to that of a Roman legionnaire, where they'll put the shield up. You notice that the shield is very large. You put the shield up in front of the face and chest so that it protects you while you thrust out with the spear from a place of a defensible position. And they also have these throwing clubs called arinkas, and these are potentially lethal weapons. They give the Maasai warriors ranged power. If you wouldn't mind stopping the video and watching the video on the list about stick fighting, Maasai stick fighting. This stick fighting was a way to settle disputes. It was a way to teach warriors combat skills, and it's done for ceremonial purposes or for entertainment. What's interesting most to me about the stick fighting is that there are different styles of stick fighting. There are styles of two-handed, wielding a giant stick, two smaller sticks, one-handed with a smaller stick, and a shield. So there are all these different techniques and different traditions, and Maasai warriors will, when they're in the junior warrior phase, they'll wander around from village to village to prove the strength and skill of their particular tradition. Okay, So we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about Maasai women. So the video on Maasai women in love, if you want to pause this and watch that video, this would be the perfect time to do so. Okay, so Maasai women control economic life. You saw that in the video. There was very little importance attached to outward shows of affection. This doesn't mean that love isn't part of the dynamic, but again, these are people who are thriving in a very harsh environment, right? So sentimentality, that kind of, in many regards, they're very similar to a kind of next week when we talk about the Japanese samurai and the code of Bushido and saving face and all of that. They're very tough people, and these kind of shows of affection, of emotion, are generally frowned upon. And like previously stated, the Maasai practice polygyny, multiple wives per husband, with large numbers of men unmarried. The women are responsible for managing the herds, along with the children, which is the source of wealth. When a woman gets married, she will build a house for her husband out of straw and dung, and that is a gift to her husband. Each wife will build her own house for the husband to live in with her, and he'll rotate from house to house. And there are some very interesting customs. If a woman commits an infidelity, her relatives will then give her husband a cow, and that's seen as something that, the cow is so valuable in this pastoralist environment, that pastoralist culture, that the man is honor-bound to accept it. The average family consists of 3 to 4 wives per husband, traditionally. The average height of a Maasai man is around 6'4", and it's not uncommon for these men to be 7 feet tall or taller. Okay. So, this is a very nutrient-rich diet. This diet of beef, roasted beef, cow blood, milk, etc., wild herbs. And the life expectancy is low, 42 for men, 45 for women. Part of that's due to violence. Part of that is due to infant mortality. You have to be careful when interpreting life expectancy statistics. You always read about how in the Middle Ages the life expectancy was 35, etc. And so a man who was 36 was a very old man. That's not true. If you made it to the age of 5, your chances of making it to into your 60s were very good. And it's the same thing with the Maasai. The reason that the life expectancy is so low is because you have men in their 70s and 80s being averaged together, men and women in their 70s and 80s being averaged together with infants who die in childbirth or in the first year of life, etc. Right? So that brings the life expectancy down. It's infant mortality that is doing it. If you survive this vulnerable period of childhood, the life cycle is generally the same as most other people in other settings. So prior to government intervention, anthropologists noted that probably around 30% of Maasai men died violently due to contention for watering holes, for herds, etc. This is something to think about when we think about hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, people living in traditional ways of life. These men have that we've seen, have a very noble bearing, very dignified appearance, and it seems like this is just my subjective opinion here, that they move with purpose. There's so many admirable qualities, but that comes with a risk. Right? That comes with the risk of dying from violence. And would the Maasai want to change, to adapt to a Western way of life? That would be up for them to decide. But there are advantages and disadvantages to any way of life. And this is just important to think about as we go through these slides. The Maasai believe that the god Ngai, who has two natures, a good black nature, an evil nature, which is red, The Maasai believe that this god, Ngai, has communion with prophets, men called Laibon. These are elderly men. You can see that this man has had his earlobes stretched as a sign of his being a prophet. He will commune with this god Ngai, and that way he will discern where the tribe should go, where the community should go, going from watering hole to watering hole. Now a little bit about specific history. Around 1500, the Maasai entered the Serengeti region, border of Kenya and Tanzania, around 1500, pushing native communities south and west. So you have all these different ethnic groups in this region: Luhia, Kikuyu, Kamba, other peoples, Luo, such as President Obama's part of his heritage is from one of these groups, Barack Obama Sr. being of the Luo ethnic group in Kenya. And these peoples constructed walled settlements, and they were agrarian in the sense that they had advanced agriculture. So they were growing staple crops, living off of these crops. They kept livestock also, but they lived a sedentary life. They weren't nomadic. They built walled settlements. They stayed in one place. And they had to build these walled settlements to adapt to the Maasai raiding their territory, taking livestock, etc. But the Maasai were seen as a serious military threat, and they began to expand their territory, the amount of land they claimed for grazing. And their population numbers reached about 500,000 at their peak in around 1750. The Maasai were able to resist the slave trade, the slave markets stretching from Egypt, the north of Egypt, which we would call Lower Egypt, ironically, and Zanzibar on the Horn of Africa. So Zanzibar was a kind of the traditional hub for slavery into southwestern Asia, southern Asia, in pre-modern, in the pre-modern period. The Maasai were able to resist this. They were able to fight off slave traders, and you can see that these very menacing looking weapons as these warriors are patrolling their environment. In fact, they were able to extort tribute from groups moving through their territory. So if you wanted to go to Zanzibar via land or take slaves from this particular region, you had to pay them a tribute to be able to do so. And the Maasai abhorred slavery due to the fact that it was seen as dishonorable to take someone captive. And this is similar to the samurai, and as we're going to talk about next week to a certain extent. You don't want to take someone as a slave, because that's a fate worse than death in the minds of the Maasai. At this point, if you wouldn't mind pausing the video and watching the video of the jumping ritual. This is a jumping ritual that the Maasai warriors do as a sign, as part of attracting women, as part of celebration, as part of demonstrating their warrior spirit. Also, it's before battles, the warriors will line up traditionally and in the past, and would jump up and down, trying to get as much height as possible as a demonstration of their power and athleticism. And of course, if the man is 7 feet 2 inches, jumping up and down, that's going to be a pretty terrifying sight if you're an enemy soldier trying to face them down. At some point, anthropologists have determined that there was a mass conflict between age sets. So the different age groups fought one another, and this is something that this is a very devastating event. The Maasai lost strength as a result of this, and they were raided and preyed upon by groups that they formerly extorted tribute from. So one group, the Kikuyu, moved south and drove the Maasai from much of their territory. The Maasai could have potentially recovered from their defeats, but with the arrival of Europeans, the situation would change. The Maasai referred to the first Europeans to arrive in their territories as Elorida, Injekat, those who confined their farts, right, due to the fact that they wore pants. Right? The Maasai men wearing robes, the trouser being an invention of Northern Europe due to the climate. It'd be the Maasai clothing much more efficient for that part of the world. But English missionaries failed to make headway. A man named Joseph Thompson, whom you see pictured here, was the first outsider to survey the Maasai territory extensively. When we talked about the Columbian Exchange, we talked about diseases. This is primarily diseases with a zootonic origin coming from animals. People in the old world, Europe, Africa, Asia, developing resistance to those diseases, so they causing them a lot of damage and death in North and South America once contact was established between continents. Well, this also is true for animals. There was a disease called rinderpest that was very virulent. It spread throughout Europe and Asia and parts of Africa that had been connected to Europe and Asia, and it attacked cattle. For the Maasai, who depended on cattle, whose cattle had no resistance to this disease, we're seeing the same kind of pattern, but in animals. About 80% of the Maasai cattle in Kenya died in the 1880s. This caused the Maasai to drop to a tenth of their former number, about 50,000, from their peak at 500,000, by 1890. And so the clan structure began to disintegrate due to this massive loss of life. On top of this, you have diseases like cholera, typhus, that tend to affect people with weakened immune systems. In 1904, the Maasai were forced to submit to British rule, and they were incorporated into the British colony of Kenya. In 1911, the Maasai were relocated to reservations, land set aside for their settlement. By the 1930s, the British had seized around 2/3 of their land, either to form estates for British aristocrats or giving them to chieftains who supported the British policies. And you can think about some of these aristocrats in Kenya, 100,000 acres or more, massive amounts of land, even by the standards of the American founding fathers. You look at men like Thomas Jefferson, and they would have 3,500 acres, 6,500 acres, and you're like, oh wow, that's a lot of space, especially if you're like me and you had some familiarity with farming growing up. You can see how much land that is, but these estates of these British aristocrats in Kenya dwarf the size of the old plantations. Just absolutely dwarf. We're talking about 100,000, 200,000 acres. In the 1960s, with decolonization, Kenya and Tanzania became independent nations, and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about European rule in the section on imperialism, the week of imperialism, and decolonization towards the end of the quarter. But these nations became independent, and the idea was to modernize and develop this economy in each of these nations. And of course, that was the Maasai lifestyle was seen as counterproductive to this. So the Maasai were encouraged and sometimes forced to adopt agrarian lifestyles, right? So they're planting crops instead of tending to cattle than their traditional lifestyle. This is perhaps the most important element of this lecture for you to take in. The creation of Western-style national parks in Kenya and Tanzania has been very difficult for the Maasai. This is due to the fact that these lands are not empty. There are people who depend on these lands for their livelihood, and this is the case in much of the world. In the West, in the United States, there was such low population density that for the government to declare regions national parks, this didn't prevent settlement. It didn't deny people resources in many instances, This is not the case in every nation on Earth, right? So adopting this American style or European style national park system can be very devastating for communities throughout the world, and it's something to think about. It's something to think about, you know, particularly people in the United States and Canada, Britain, Australia, France, Germany, etc. may see environmentalism as kind of a sacred goal, but we have to think about the human toll, particularly, and this is a perfect example. Okay, so we're going to switch gears now. We're going to talk a little bit about Africa in general, and then about West Africa in particularly how the climate has shaped some of these civilizations that have emerged in these regions. If you notice, there's a great amount of climatic diversity in Africa. Africa is one of the most diverse continents in terms of climate, in terms of vegetation, in terms of languages, cultures, etc. And you can go what, relatively speaking, is a very, very short distance from desert, intense desert, the Sahara Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, into tropical rainforest, right? The opposite of this environment in every way. So what that means is that there are significant natural barriers to the spread of ideas. When you look at these civilizations over here, there's very little contact, relatively speaking, between these civilizations, primarily due to many of these natural obstacles. So that's a difficulty that these societies have to overcome. Also, due to its position relative to the equator, much of Africa struggles with malaria. This is one of the most intense limiting factors for human urbanization there is naturally occurring in the world. In fact, the human body is so adamant about resisting malaria that there is a disease called sickle cell anemia, which is basically the gene, the malaria resistance gene, copied twice. So natural selection will tolerate the damage from sickle cell anemia rather than if that means resisting malaria. So with malaria, about 1.3% of the economic growth that would occur in much of Africa is lost due to malaria each year, due to the deaths, due to the lost time at work, due to resources needed to combat malaria. So there's a huge goal for these empires, one of which is to maintain equilibrium with the natural environment. This is not a natural environment that can be easily controlled and altered to suit human purposes. This is an environment that is very difficult to contend with. With that said, we're going to take a look at some civilizations who were successful in shaping their natural environment and dominating the very difficult conditions around them. And again, the age set system that we talked about with the Maasai was employed by other cultures as well throughout much of Central Africa. And the reason for this is that it reduces population density. And where you have lower population density, you have decreased risk of sleeping sickness and malaria, as well as Ebola and other diseases. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at which video was it? Oh, I can't remember. So the tsetse fly causes a disease called sleeping sickness if you're bitten by this creature, that basically puts you in a catatonic state and can cause death. And of course, stagnant water can lead to the spread of mosquitoes, which leads to the spread of malaria. And of course, the greater the population density, the more damage that can be done by this. And of course, these civilizations had evolved to counter this. There were cultural mores and norms designed to prevent the spread of malaria. And biologically speaking, people living in these environments had developed resistances to this particular disease. Europeans who had no resistance to this disease could not colonize the interior of Africa. For example, the Portuguese had to remain primarily along the coast for several centuries due to the fact that Europeans with no resistance to malaria found this disease to be too lethal to overcome, to exist in these regions. And it won't be till the development of a South American Quechua traditional medicine called quinine that will be refined in the 19th century into a way to resist malaria will Europeans be able to enter this continent in significant ways. So you saw in the Jared Diamond video how African cultures had developed traditions of lowering population densities, and of course resistances had developed. When we talk about imperialism, we'll talk about European states extracting resources from sub-Saharan Africa, and this changed the geography, the face of the landscape, due to the fact that European-style, Asian-style cities were constructed in Africa, and of course this is an unprecedented amount of population density, leading to the actual mutation of malaria and mass death in the contemporary period. In West Africa, one kingdom that managed to tame the rainforest was called Benin, and this is different territory than the Republic of Benin that we know today. This is actually in around southern Nigeria. I'm going to give you a description by Duarte Pacheco Pereira, Portuguese who had encountered the Kingdom of Benin, written about it. The Kingdom of Benin is about 80 leagues long and 40 wide. It is usually at war with its neighbors and takes many captives, whom we buy at 12 or 15 brass bracelets each, or for copper bracelets which they prize more. This is important because the economy of Benin was based on warfare and slavery, and primarily warfare to acquire populations to sell into slavery. And this lasted until the mid to late 19th century. The Edo people were the dominant ethnic group, and the Edo military would raid the interior rainforest regions, take people as prisoners, and then they would be sold either to merchants who would then take those slaves through North and East Africa into North Africa and Southwestern Asia, or to Europeans after the Portuguese. Remember Prince Henry the Navigator, as he began to muscle his way into the primarily Ottoman Empire dominated slave trade in West Africa. He began to muscle in to get his cut. People began to be taken across the Atlantic in ever-growing numbers to feed the labor shortages in North and South America created by the mass death of epidemic disease. So the Kingdom of Benin would trade slaves for firearms and rum. And of course, the firearms obtained would enable the kings of Benin to acquire more prisoners to sell into slavery, and the cycle would continue. And this world demand for slave labor led to the destabilization of much of this part of the world due to the fact that economics heavily incentivized warfare. You can see this aristocrat from Benin. He has these ritual votive objects, ancestral figurines. He basically is displaying his lineage with these objects. And you can see these two slave children. One has a fan, the other has a scimitar, and you can imagine, you know, being struck with with the blade of this. This would be, you know, this would be absolutely, you know, it could easily chop off an arm, cut right through your chest. Benin City was renowned for its public security. One of the things that the European merchants who arrived noticed is that there was very little crime. Their persons and property were respected, and this is because of the kind of draconian law system, a legal system of the kings of Benin. And it's kind of analogous today to Kigali, Rwanda, a very safe city with very an intense legal system designed to value safety. And of course that's a good way of thinking of Benin. The king, or Oba, of Benin, you can see this mask, ceremonial mask of Oba Asigi. Oba Asigi was one of the great kings of Benin. He established ties with the Portuguese, and he traded slaves in exchange for military equipment. And of course he obtained that population from the interior rainforest regions near his own kingdom. Another political body, the Arrow Confederacy. You can see these warriors of the Arrow Confederacy here with their distinctive neck bracelets, and they also waged war in the interior of what's now Nigeria to obtain populations of prisoners to sell into slavery. Before the transatlantic slave trade developed, this is the slave trade through North and East Africa into southwestern Asia was the dominant form of slavery, of the export of people out of Western Africa. So as many as 10 million people may have been involuntarily exported from West Africa in the manner of leading people through land routes to either Zanzibar in the east or to Tunisia, Tripoli in the north, or cities in Egypt like Alexandria, to be sold into slavery, to serve as harem guards, to become eunuchs, which means they would be castrated males who would serve as harem guards, or concubines for wealthy men in the Ottoman Empire, sometimes as chattel labor, meaning that's a form of slavery. That's the form of slavery that existed in the New World, North and South America, where you have agricultural laborers or slaves working as miners, very backbreaking work. And in the Ottoman Empire, in particular, much of the Islamic world, you had a tradition of slave soldiers, like when we talked about the Janissaries, right? So very diverse in terms of the different roles that slaves could play in that part of the world. Of course, chattel slavery was present there, but chattel slavery would dominate in the plantations of North and South America. When large numbers of the indigenous population perished in North and South America due to spread of epidemic disease, the conquistadors, other Europeans who had conquered much of these continents, had massive tracts of land that were very fertile, that could grow cash crops and yield fortunes. But they did not have the labor to do that. And also in many instances, if you ever read the diary of William Byrd, of the planter of Virginia, this is a perfect example. William Byrd purchased African slaves due to the fact that the Powhatan Indians of Virginia, other indigenous groups, knew the land so well that they could not be forced to work the land. They could always escape and resist due to their intimate knowledge of the geography. But African labor started to be imported. Slave labor started to be imported into North and South America, with most of the populations going to South America, particularly Brazil. and also in the Caribbean, in North America, what would become the southern United States. So the route to get to the Americas from Western Africa, we call this the Middle Passage. And this was one of the most brutal routes, most brutal journeys that human beings have ever taken. Of course, the West Africans who were taken across this Middle Passage, this was something that was forced on them against their will. So this voyage took around 4 to 6 weeks. And during the early period of the transatlantic slave trade, we're talking about the 16th, 17th centuries, we're looking at mortality rates on board that may have reached 50%. So half the people crammed into the bowels of these ships may have perished. Over the course of the entire transatlantic slave trade, around 1/4 of the people who would be shipped from West Africa to the Americas did not survive. Okay. And this was due to the fact that, you know, as cruel as it sounds, it's evidence of human cruelty that these merchants would minimize the necessities and amenities provided to these people being taken across the Atlantic to maximize their profits. This is something that unbelievable cruelty done for the sake of profit, which is something that a theme that we'll see popping up again and again in terms of history. So the vast majority of slaves in the Americas worked as agricultural laborers in the production of cash crops. So we're looking at crops grown for profit rather than sustenance. Tobacco, indigo, sugar, coffee, cocoa, cotton. Cash crops, some of them are edible, sugar, coffee, cocoa, but they're not necessities of life. They're luxury items. Luxury items are produced from these crops. And so that meant that those who would be taken across the Middle Passage had to be useful in an agricultural sense. So start looking at males primarily between 14 and 35 years of age, and eventually as the demand grows, women will be taken across the Middle Passage also in order to reproduce populations of slave labor. We're looking at about 12 million people, of 20 million surviving this journey. We call the trade route, of which the Middle Passage was 1/3, this trade route the triangular trade. And this is the trade route, the economic system that would replace the Silk Road as the most wealth-producing commercial system in the world at the time. We call it the triangular trade because it links 3 regions: Europe, Western Africa, and the Americas. Okay, so here's how this worked. We have Oba-Asigi in Benin and other West African kings and queens. They have captured prisoners of war in the interior of their realms. They will sell these to the Portuguese, who will then take these slaves to their colony of Brazil. And then in Brazil, they will grow sugar. That sugar will be taken back to Portugal, where it will be manufactured into rum. The rum will then be sold to Oba-Asigi for more slaves, who will then be taken back to Brazil to produce more rum, more sugar, to be taken to Portugal to produce more rum, to acquire more slaves, and so on and so on. So this is a process that grew exponentially. And it's not just with Portugal and Oba-Asigi and Benin. You had the French colony of what's now Haiti growing sugar. You had South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Florida in the United States participating in this process also. And this enriched all 3 corners. The European manufacturers derived most of the profit due to the fact that they were producing the manufactured goods. The West African kings and queens, who had monarchs who had participated in this, they also became wealthier as a result of and they gained, particularly gained military equipment to establish their dominance in much of this part of the world. And of course the plantation owners, the slave owners, they also became enriched as a result of this process. In African states and in Europe itself, you have many different forms of slavery. You have slaves who had particular rights, or certain rights were reserved for example, the janissaries. Even though they were technically slaves, they could carry weapons. They were trained elite soldiers. They could rise to high posts in the Ottoman government. So obviously they could be educated. In some parts of the old world, slaves could work. When they weren't working for the slave owner, they could work on their own time and eventually buy their freedom or earn their freedom in a particular way. The law might be structured so that if a slave had a child, the child was not enslaved, the child was born free. There's a great amount of variety in terms of how slavery functioned in much of the old world. And of course in the old world you also had chattel slavery. You had in some of these West African states, you had human beings being forced to work in mines, being forced to work on plantations, and of course this occurs today. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But chattel slavery, this most brutal form of slavery, chattel is a term that means movable personal property, so I'm holding this bottle of Crush grape soda right now that I'm drinking, right? If you could see how, you can't see because this is a video, but I have gone through 3 bottles, 1 Mountain Dew, 1 grape soda, 1 orange soda, throughout my making this video. It's kind of a joke when I'm giving a lecture in person that I'm constantly drinking some form of Coke. I'm from the South, so I call them all Coke. Anyway, where was I at? Okay, so this bottle of Coke here, grape soda, it is my property. I've purchased it. I can do whatever I want with this bottle. I can burn it. I could, even though it would make me sick and try to puke, I could try to eat it. It's my property. It has no agency of its own whatsoever. And chattel slavery, apply this logic, this system to human beings, and you can see how brutal chattel slavery was. These people had no recourse, no options, no rights, no agency whatsoever. Legally speaking, of course, they maintained their agency, resisted the system as any human being would, but they had all of their rights and liberties stripped away. That's why you, in contrast to say the janissaries, in Mississippi in the 1850s, it being a criminal act to teach an enslaved person how to read. And when we get to the lecture on the Enlightenment and then the abolitionist movement, and we start talking about Frederick Douglass was able to teach himself to read in secret. And when he was caught attempting to educate himself, he was beaten for this. Other slaves on the plantation would kind of rat him out to the overseer and the slave master so that he would be punished. And so he had all of the convergence of forces bearing down on him, trying to prevent him from becoming educated. And this is something that existed within chattel slavery. Okay, this is not something that exists in every form of slavery that existed in the old world. But chattel slavery was the most profitable in North and South America, so the numbers of chattel slaves in the world would skyrocket once this transatlantic slave trade began to develop. At this time, I'd like for you to pause the presentation and watch the 2 videos on slavery. One, slavery in Sudan. If you've heard of the crisis in Darfur, I'll give a quick summary of it to a certain extent, the causes. You have a split in Sudan between northern and southern Sudan. You have people speaking Arabic in the north. You have people who, and this population is primarily Muslim. You have a primarily Christian population in the south, and the Christian population has struggled with the Muslim north for political control. In northern Sudan, one of the ways in which the Northerners maintained control of the Southerners was through slavery. Okay, and of course the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, due to that civil war, people obviously are not willing to be brutalized into slavery. But watch these videos, and the first is on slavery in Sudan, modern slavery in Sudan, and the second is on slavery of migrant workers coming primarily from South Asia, India, and Pakistan to build Dubai. Dubai being a very wealthy place, a popular resort for people like Paris Hilton, Chris Brown, some of these other, if you've heard popular pop songs and videos, etc., of famous celebrities going and spending millions of dollars in Dubai. This was something that was built on the backs of human suffering, on slave labor. I'm just directing you to these videos to point out that there are more people enslaved today than there were in 1865 when the American Civil War ended and the United States ratified the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. Okay, so outlawing legal slavery for anything except the punishment of a crime, which we'll talk about when we get to abolition. But that's something to think about. The fact that there are millions of people held in involuntary bondage today. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about, just to give you a very brief kind of geographic survey of some different peoples in Africa. You have Berbers, who dominate the north, Berbers and Arabs. These are Moroccans, Algerians, Tunisians, Libyans. These were nomadic peoples who migrated into northern Africa from southwestern Asia, probably around 20,000 years before present, if you look at DNA and different genetic tests. And as these people push south through the Sahara, there are Nilo-Saharan peoples to the south of them. The Maasai are Nilotic, a Nilotic ethnic group, and these Nilo-Saharan peoples would be some of the groups who would establish some of these great empires in West Africa, such as the Kingdom of Songhai. And of course, I don't want to spend too much time on this. You can pause this and look at each of the slides. Songhai, it's the capital of Timbuktu. This was an Islamic empire. You can see here this mosque, built out of mud brick. It's still standing, even though it's hundreds of years old, in spite of the fact that there's this tree here. This is a very arid environment, so rain will not eat away at it. And it's amazing, though, that there's very little actual wood, even though, again, there's this tree in this picture, wood from which to build structures. But the human brain is so resourceful. People have such ingenuity that they can find a way around this and still build lasting structures. And Timbuktu, the capital city of Songhai, was one of the most famous cities in the world at the time. When we're looking around the 16th century, it was a center of Islamic learning, scholarship. It had a very famous university, which in the contemporary societies, there are universities everywhere you turn. Lindenwood having a lot of campuses being a perfect example. But this wasn't the case in the past. Right? Having a university, that was a huge deal. That made you a center for learning in the world. And this was the case with Timbuktu. And Timbuktu drew people from all over the world. It drew Christian merchants from Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. It drew Jewish merchants from all over Europe, North Africa, Southwestern Asia. It drew Muslim merchants from the Ottoman Empire, from North African states. And it drew merchants from the interior of Western Africa. And of course, Timbuktu was a great hub of the slave trade at the time. And the dominant group, the Songhai themselves, who dominated this empire, they became fabulously wealthy. And the successor state, the Empire of Mali, in You look at, not successor state, but you look at the Empire of Mali. This is a similar state to that of Songhai. You can see this wealth, just how wealthy this part of the world was, in the sense that Mansa Musa, the Sultan of Mali, he went on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and you give alms as you go on your journey to the Hajj to see the Kaaba, the meteoric black stone in the heart of Mecca. And one of the tenets of Islam is that you have to give alms to the poor. So he unloaded so much gold in the form of gifts to the poor in northern Africa, Tripoli all the way to Egypt, that he caused pretty severe inflation for a period of several years, okay, because he was putting so much new gold into that economy. So this was a very, very wealthy, in terms of the elites of these societies, they were very wealthy, very influential. But there were problems. One big problem was that you have an Islamic elite attempting to rule over non-Islamic populations, very diverse non-Islamic populations in the interior of many of these societies. And Islamicization wasn't something that was smooth in all instances. So you have rebellions against impositions of Islamic law. The sultans, the policies weren't always evenly implemented in different regions. And this weakened these empires. It created succession disputes. It created instability. In 1591, with the Songhai, a Moroccan army of around 300 soldiers, a large number of them were slaves from southern Europe who were skilled with muskets. They crossed the Sahara and defeated the Songhai army at Tondibi. And this is important to note that on a much smaller scale, the Ottoman Empire would raid different ports in Italy, Spain, southern France, and also in Ireland, England, and northern Europe as well, and capture people and introduce them into slave markets as well. I included these images of the Mandinka. These are Muslim women, and this picture of the Spulati man, because this conical hat is really aesthetically, it's a very awesome looking hat to me. There was a man in, well, I'll talk about that as we move later on, about a man in modern day who adopted this hat as one of his signature aspects of his dress. Now we're going to talk about a warlord named Idris Alama, or Aluma. And this man was a very, very skilled military leader. He established connections with the Ottoman Empire. He would primarily capture prisoners of war, and he would make them eunuchs, and he would send young girls to northern Africa in return for horses and firearms. Right? And this is the same kind of thing with, Boko Haram. If you've seen in Boko Haram, the militant group in Nigeria who captured a large number of young girls, and you've seen, for example, the picture of the First Lady with the placard that says "Bring back our girls." Right? You've seen that in the media moving around. Boko Haram is similar to how Kanem Bornu and Idris Aluma, how this state worked. People would be captured, they would be sold to obtain military supplies, just like Boko Haram wishes to do with these young women that they've taken in the present day. So Idris Aluma was able to overcome his enemies very easily, primarily due to the fact that he had an army that was well drilled, well trained with gunpowder weaponry. In particular, he had mounted regiment of camel mounted soldiers who had firearms. They were very effective in moving on the desert terrain. And when he conquered territories, he attempted to rule in a manner similar to that of the Songhai, the Milanese Empire, etc. in that he attempted to impose an Islamic legal system and some of these populations were non-Islamic, and this created social difficulties. One of the practices in Kanem Bornu of the non-Islamic population was serial marriages. So man and woman will sign a marriage contract for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, whatever. And then when that contract expires, they can choose to renew the contract, or they can go on and be with someone else. This obviously contradicts Christian, Muslim, Jewish, the Abrahamic religions' notions of marriage, right? That marriage is to death do us part, right? Idris al-Ulama tried to introduce this to his subjects. And we can see in this document by Ibn Fartura this description of his policies. So he made the pilgrimage and visited Medina with delight. Among the benefits which God conferred upon the Sultan Idris al-Ulama was the acquisition of Turkish musketeers and numerous household slaves who became skilled in firing muskets. So Turkish military advisors, janissaries, and then he raised his own corps of slave soldiers in a similar fashion. Anyway, among those most surprising of his acts was the stand he took against obscenity and adultery, so that no such thing took place openly in his time. Formerly the people had been indifferent to such offenses. In fact, he was a power among his people, and from him came their strength. The Sultan was intent on the clear path laid down by the Quran in all his affairs and actions. So this society of Kanem Bornu, very militarily powerful, raised up by Idris al-Ulama, or Alama, who died at the age of 37. Okay, so one thing that I want to point out that we can discuss right now is the sheer diversity in these African societies. Africa is a huge continent. Geographically speaking, there's a lot of diversity. Ethnically speaking, there's a lot of diversity. Linguistically speaking, politically speaking. So this is a continent that's really way too diverse to generalize about, to try to summarize for just a lecture, for this course. I've thrown this in to the mix just because I want some aspects of African history to be discussed during the course, because that's not often the case in much of the introductory courses, world history courses. But keep in mind that we've had to jump around quite a bit, talking about in East Africa, talking about the Maasai, talking about Benin, Kanem Bornu. These are states thousands of miles apart from one another. These are cultures thousands of miles apart from one another. And, there's just tremendous diversity, as much, if not more, in Asia and Europe, right? There's a ton of cultural diversity within those continents as well. So we can't really generalize and talk about Africa and Africans. We have to be more specific. And this is just to prep you for the movie Delta Boys, if you want to watch that movie. If you're not interested in watching that movie, I guess you can stop listening to the lecture now. But this is just to set the stage. Talking about Nigeria, in the 1960s, after Nigerian independence, there was a separatist state in the region called Biafra, the Niger Delta, the southernmost region of Nigeria. And this is significant in that in the Niger Delta, this is a region from which many, many people were taken across the Atlantic into North and South America. So culturally speaking, genetically speaking, there are ties to populations living in North and South America from this region. We have some words in the English language. For example, okra is an Igbo word spoken in Nigeria. It's actually a crop that was taken from this part of the world as well. When we talk about famine, we'll talk about famine historically. For example, in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century in Germany, there was a massive famine. About a third of the population of Germany and Czechoslovakia perished partly due to this famine. We had a famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s. There was a famine in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. There's a famine right now in North Korea. All of these famines are engineered by human beings. Crop failure, environmental problems are usually never severe enough, and this is not always the case, but most of the time they're never severe enough to not be overcome by human ingenuity. When we start to see people dying of starvation, this is generally something that's done by governments. All right. Stalin, for example, starving people in the Ukraine because they were opposed to his rule. In northern North Korea, people are starving to death because they're opposed. That's generally where the regime, faith in the regime is very low. And of course, in this contentious region in southern Nigeria, there was famine. Just as the picture we'll look at of the Sudan in a moment. And this, just to stop and talk about this photograph from the Sudan, taken by this photographer Kevin Carter, who actually committed suicide after taking this picture of this buzzard stalking this little girl trying to walk to a food station. This is something that was engineered by a government, again, by the northern Sudanese government. So this region in southern Nigeria that's the focus of this movie, Delta Boys, this is a region from which people were taken as slaves. It's a region from which people have been deliberately starved. It is a region which has fought for its independence and been forcibly reintegrated into the nation of Nigeria. And also, to complicate all of this, this is a region that's very wealthy in terms of natural resources. So there's quite a bit of oil, natural gas in this territory. Because the people in the territory are not politically dominant, though, they don't enjoy the proceeds of those resources. So the government in Lagos, and the northerners in Nigeria, take these proceeds from the oil drilled in southern Nigeria, and they use it to develop their own regions. So the people in the Niger Delta, or river state, they are deprived of the benefits of their own natural resources. And so there have been separatist movements, rebel movements rising up in this region since the 1960s to try to redress these situations. And this movie, Delta Boys, profiles one such group. It's very interesting looking inside the lives of these rebels, their travails, what they're fighting against, etc. And of course the filmmaker himself, very brave for kind of injecting himself into that situation. But it's a very interesting movie. If you watch, I strongly encourage you to watch it. And it will fulfill one of the film requirements for the course. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. If anyone has any questions whatsoever, feel free to email me about anything. I know that this is getting to you a little bit late. I think finally we have all of our technical problems solved, so we should be able to move at a very rapid pace from here on out. All right, and don't forget to post in the lecture discussion board just one paragraph about something you thought that was interesting or notable or whatever. Any random thought. Your thoughts are always valuable. All right, thanks.